Have you ever walked into a room and instantly felt like you knew exactly what kind of people you were surrounded by? Maybe you've had moments where you could sense someone's intentions just from a single glance. But what if I told you that this wasn't some mysterious sixth sense, but rather a skill you could learn? The ability to read people, analyze their behavior, posture, and expressions can change the way you navigate social and professional interactions. Imagine having the power to understand someone before they even speak. Intrigued? Join me on this journey, where we'll uncover how to read people at first sight, giving you a skill set that will sharpen your intuition and help you master any social situation. Chapter 1: A New Beginning. Mark had always been fascinated by people. The way they talked, moved, and reacted to different situations held a mystery he longed to understand. But despite his curiosity, he often found himself struggling to connect with others. Whether it was at work or in social settings, Mark felt like he couldn't quite get a read on people. He wondered how some people could walk into a room and instantly know who to trust, who to approach, and who to avoid. It seemed like a superpower, one that he desperately wished he had. Everything changed the day Mark stumbled upon an article titled, "How to Read People Like a Book." The headline grabbed him immediately. Could this be the answer to the frustration he'd been feeling for years? He dove into the article, discovering a world of subtle cues, body language, and psychological insights that seemed to explain what he had been missing. The article was only a glimpse into a much larger world, but it left Mark hungry for more. He began researching the topic obsessively, reading books, watching videos, and even practicing the techniques he learned in his day-to-day interactions. Over time, he realized that reading people wasn't about some innate talent or magical intuition. It was about understanding patterns in human behavior. As Mark's journey began, he discovered that analyzing people on first sight was a skill that anyone could master with enough practice and knowledge. Chapter 2: The First Encounter. Mark's first real test came at a company networking event. He hated these kinds of gatherings, mostly because he always felt out of place and unsure of himself. But this time, he decided to approach the situation differently. Armed with what he had learned about reading people, he saw the event as an opportunity to practice. The moment Mark stepped into the room, he scanned the faces around him, immediately putting his new skills to the test. He knew that people often reveal more in their body language than they do in their words. So he paid close attention to how people were standing, the expressions on their faces, and the subtle movements they made. One man in particular caught Mark's eye, a tall, confident-looking executive who seemed to command the attention of everyone around him. The man stood with his feet shoulder-width apart, his hands casually in his pockets, and his chest slightly puffed out. His posture screamed confidence and authority. Mark observed that whenever someone spoke to him, the man would nod slightly, maintaining direct eye contact and giving just enough of a smile to signal approval. He rarely blinked, which, as Mark had learned, was a sign of dominance and control in the conversation. This was someone used to leading, someone who expected to be listened to. Mark approached the group, and as the conversation unfolded, he noticed how this executive subtly shifted his weight onto his back foot when someone challenged him, only to lean forward again when making his own point. It was like watching a boxer in the ring, strategically moving to maintain dominance. Mark had never noticed these kinds of subtleties before, but now they were all he could see. It was like learning to read between the lines of a conversation that wasn't being spoken. Suddenly, Mark realized he wasn't just observing the executive, he was anticipating his moves, predicting his reactions. The man was a classic example of someone who valued control and respect. Two things Mark could use to navigate the conversation effectively. When it was Mark's turn to speak, he used what he had learned. He stood tall, made direct eye contact, and spoke with conviction, mirroring the executive's confidence without appearing confrontational. To Mark's surprise, the executive nodded in approval, and by the end of the night, the two had exchanged business cards, marking the beginning of what would become a valuable professional relationship. Mark left the event feeling energized. He had finally cracked the code. He had read the executive before the man had even spoken a word, and that knowledge had given him the upper hand in their interaction. Chapter 3: The Subtle Art of Observation. Mark's success at the networking event was just the beginning. As he continued practicing his newfound skill, he realized that reading people wasn't just about decoding dominant personalities. It was about understanding everyone, from the quiet introverts to the loud extroverts. Mark became obsessed with observing people in all kinds of settings, on the train, at the grocery store, in coffee shops, and everywhere he looked, he saw new clues that helped him decipher the unspoken language of human behavior. One afternoon, Mark sat at his favorite cafe, quietly sipping his coffee while watching the people around him. He had learned by now that people often give away their emotional states through their body language, even when they're trying to hide it. His eyes landed on a young woman sitting at a table across from him. She had a stack of papers in front of her and was hunched over, scribbling notes furiously. But something was off. Her posture was tense, her brow furrowed in concentration. Mark knew that when people are relaxed, they tend to lean back in their chairs, their movements slow and deliberate. This woman, however, was leaning forward, her shoulders drawn up toward her ears and her hand gripping the pen so tightly that her knuckles were turning white. She wasn't just working, she was stressed. Curious, Mark decided to test his theory. He had read that when people are in a heightened emotional state, their peripheral awareness shrinks, meaning they become so focused on their task that they might not even notice what's happening around them. He casually stood up and walked by her table, observing how she didn't even glance up as he passed. She was completely absorbed in her work, too stressed to acknowledge the world around her. Mark smiled to himself, realizing that he had just read the situation correctly. The woman's body language had given away her emotional state, and without even speaking to her, Mark understood that she was overwhelmed, likely facing a deadline or dealing with a personal issue. As Mark left the cafe that day, he felt a sense of satisfaction. Reading people had become second nature to him, and it was starting to change the way he interacted with the world. He no longer felt like an outsider in social situations. He had developed the ability to understand others on a deeper level, and it was giving him a sense of control he had never experienced before. Before we dive into the next chapter, we have noticed that 72% of you who listen to our video are not yet subscribed to the channel. Please help support our channel by hitting the subscribe button and like the video. Thanks for inspiring us to create more content for you. Chapter 4. Navigating the Office Politics. At work, things were starting to shift for Mark as well. He had always been the quiet type, someone who kept his head down and focused on getting the job done. But now he was beginning to see the subtle dynamics that played out in the office. Dynamics that he had never noticed before. There was tension between two of his colleagues, Lisa and Tom, that had been brewing for weeks. They never outright argued, but their interactions were always cold and distant. Before learning how to read people, Mark might have assumed that they just didn't get along. But now he could see the real problem. Lisa was someone who valued efficiency and direct communication. She always stood tall, her arms uncrossed, and she spoke in a clear, no-nonsense tone. Tom, on the other hand, was more laid back. He often slouched in his chair during meetings, his arms crossed over his chest, and he tended to make jokes or use humor to lighten the mood. The problem wasn't that Lisa and Tom didn't like each other. It was that they had completely different communication styles. Lisa saw Tom's relaxed approach as a lack of seriousness, while Tom saw Lisa's efficiency as cold and unapproachable. One day during a team meeting, Mark watched as Lisa presented a new project proposal. As she spoke, Tom leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed, a slight smirk on his face. It was subtle, but Mark could tell that Tom wasn't taking Lisa's proposal seriously. And sure enough, when Lisa finished, Tom made a joke about how complicated the project seemed, brushing it off as unnecessary work. Mark noticed the way Lisa's posture stiffened, her lips pressing into a thin line as she shot Tom a quick glare. It was clear that she was frustrated, but she didn't say anything. The tension in the room was palpable. Later that day, Mark found himself alone with Tom in the break room. Remembering what he had learned about reading people, Mark decided to approach the situation carefully. Instead of criticizing Tom for his behavior, Mark asked, "Hey, I noticed you seemed a little skeptical about Lisa's proposal earlier. What's your take on it?" Tom shrugged, leaning against the counter. "I don't know, man. She's always so uptight about everything. It's like she can't relax." Mark nodded, understanding now that Tom's issue wasn't with the proposal itself. It was with Lisa's approach. Tom valued a more laid-back, flexible work environment, while Lisa thrived on structure and efficiency. Maybe she just takes the work really seriously, Mark suggested. I think she's just trying to make sure we get everything right. But I get where you're coming from. Her style's a little different from yours. Tom seemed to relax a bit at Mark's understanding tone. Mark knew that the key to resolving the tension between Lisa and Tom wasn't about forcing them to like each other. It was about helping them see each other's perspectives. Chapter 5. The Power of Empathy. As Mark continued to hone his ability to read people, he realized that understanding others wasn't just about recognizing their body language or analyzing their behavior. It was about empathy. Truly reading someone required stepping into their shoes and seeing the world from their perspective. One evening, Mark was at a dinner party hosted by a close friend. The atmosphere was lively, with people chatting and laughing over wine and appetizers. Mark found himself sitting next to an older man named Jim, who was relatively quiet compared to the rest of the group. Jim sat with his hands folded in his lap, his eyes scanning the room as if he were an observer rather than a participant. Curious, Mark decided to strike up a conversation. He asked Jim about his life, his career, and his interests, genuinely interested in getting to know him better. At first, Jim's answers were short and guarded, as if he didn't trust Mark's intentions. But as Mark continued to ask thoughtful questions and listen attentively, Jim began to open up. Jim revealed that he had recently retired after a long career in finance, and he was struggling to adjust to life without the structure and purpose that work had provided. He spoke about how he missed the camaraderie of his colleagues and the sense of accomplishment that came with closing a big deal. As Jim spoke, Mark noticed how his posture shifted. He went from sitting hunched over, as if carrying a weight on his shoulders, to sitting more upright, his hands gesturing as he talked about the things he was passionate about. It was as if, through the conversation, Jim was reconnecting with a part of himself that he had lost. Mark realized that Jim wasn't just an introvert or someone who preferred to sit on the sidelines. He was a man who was grappling with a major life transition. And by taking the time to listen and empathize, Mark had given Jim the space to express his feelings. By the end of the night, Jim thanked Mark for the conversation, saying, "I don't usually open up to people, but you made it easy. It's nice to talk to someone who really listens." For Mark, this was a powerful moment. He realized that reading people wasn't just about analyzing their behavior or predicting their actions. It was about connecting with them on a deeper level. It was about understanding their struggles, their desires, and their emotions, and using that understanding to build stronger, more meaningful relationships. Chapter 6. The Silent Language. Mark's journey into reading people wasn't just limited to social and professional settings. As he continued to refine his skills, he became fascinated by the idea of nonverbal communication, the subtle cues that people give off without even realizing it. Body language, facial expressions, gestures. These were all part of the silent language that spoke volumes about a person's thoughts and emotions. One weekend, Mark attended a family gathering. His cousin Emily, who had always been a bit of a mystery to the rest of the family, was there. Emily was known for keeping to herself, rarely engaging in conversation, and often retreating to a quiet corner during social events. Some family members thought she was shy, while others assumed she just didn't like being around people. But Mark, armed with his newfound knowledge of reading people, decided to take a closer look. He observed Emily throughout the day, paying attention to her body language and facial expressions. What he saw surprised him. Emily wasn't just shy. She was anxious. Her movements were small and restrained, her arms often crossed over her chest, as if to shield herself from the world. Her eyes darted around the room, rarely making direct eye contact with anyone, and her hands fidgeted nervously in her lap. Mark realized that Emily wasn't avoiding people because she didn't like them. She was uncomfortable in social situations. Her anxiety was manifesting in her body language, making her appear distant and uninterested when, in reality, she was just trying to manage her discomfort. Feeling empathetic, Mark decided to approach Emily in a way that would make her feel more at ease. He sat next to her and started a conversation, but instead of diving into small talk or asking personal questions, he kept the conversation light and casual. He spoke in a calm, gentle tone, giving Emily plenty of space to respond when she felt comfortable. To his surprise, Emily gradually began to open up. She talked about her work, her love for photography, and how she often felt overwhelmed in large social gatherings. Mark listened attentively, making sure not to push her beyond her comfort zone. By the end of the day, Emily seemed more relaxed, even smiling as they said their goodbyes. Mark realized that by reading her body language and adjusting his approach, he had been able to connect with her in a way that no one else in the family had. It was a reminder that reading people wasn't just about understanding them, it was about responding to them in a way that made them feel seen and heard. Chapter 7. The Final Mastery. Months had passed since Mark first began his journey into reading people, and he had come a long way. What had started as a curiosity had turned into a powerful skill that transformed the way he interacted with the world. Whether he was at work, at social events, or even just walking down the street, Mark found himself picking up on the subtle cues that revealed so much about the people around him. But as he reflected on his journey, Mark realized that the true power of reading people didn't come from manipulating situations or using his knowledge for personal gain. It came from the ability to connect with others on a deeper level, to understand their struggles and joys, and to respond with empathy and compassion. He had learned that reading people wasn't about becoming a mind reader or a master manipulator. It was about becoming a better listener, a better observer, and ultimately a better friend, colleague, and human being. And so as Mark continued to navigate the complexities of life, he knew that he would always carry with him the lessons he had learned. The ability to read people had given him more than just insight into the minds of others. It had given him the tools to build stronger, more meaningful relationships, and to navigate the world with confidence, empathy, and understanding. Conclusion. Reading people is a skill that anyone can learn, and as Mark's journey shows, it's a skill that can change your life. By paying attention to body language, understanding different communication styles, and responding with empathy, you can build stronger connections, navigate social situations with ease, and ultimately live a more fulfilling life. If you're ready to start your own journey into reading people, remember that it all begins with observation. The next time you walk into a room, take a moment to really look at the people around you. What do their postures, expressions, and movements tell you about their state of mind? The more you practice, the more intuitive it will become. And soon, like Mark, you'll find yourself not just reading people, but truly understanding them.